Fanny Fern was an American newspaper columnist, novelist, and writer of short stories during the 50s to 70s. Her famous novel Ruth Hall was based on her life and the years that she spent with her first husband, and when he died, she fell to poverty, but she achieved financial independence as a journalist. Fern was born on July 9, 1811 in Portland, and in 1849 she was pressured by her family into marrying again, but 2 years later she left her husband because she was against him about his thoughts. As a result, her family disowned her and she had to move to New York to become the most important columnist at that time. The story How Husbands May Rule is a consequence of Fern's thought because it illustrates the aspects of traditional home and women's submission at that time.
Literary movement. The related literary period was Romanticism. These are the three main characteristics of this movement. First, the Romantic period was an artistic, literary, musical, and intellectual movement that was originated in Europe at the end of the 18th century. Second, Romanticism was characterized by having a tendency for individualism as well as glorification of the medieval era. It was partly a reaction to the Industrial Revolution, the aristocratic social and political rules of the Enlightenment. Third, the movement was focused on intense emotion as an authentic source of aesthetic experience, placing new emphasis on elements such as apprehension, horror, terror, and awe. These feelings confronted the new aesthetic categories of the sublimity and beauty of nature.
The key historical event relevant during the time of Fanny Fern was the Civil War in the United States. This war began in 1861 due to tensions between the northern and southern states over slavery, state rights, and westward expansion. Also, during this period, women were the ones who had to manage the household, while their husbands and sons were fighting battles. In addition, on the battlefield, women helped supply the soldiers, provided medical care, and worked as spies. It was the first time in American history that women played a significant role in a war effort, and the first time that American women turned their attention to the war outside the home. In fact, Fanny Fern was a journalist and a novelist in the Civil War era. She offered her views on topics as Civil War camps and prison reform.
Point of view. The point of view refers to who tells the story and how it is told. In that sense, in this short story by Fanny Fern, the point of view is third-person narrator because she uses sentences like this. "Dear Mary," said Harry to his little wife, "I have a favor to ask of you." In this short story, the narrator is an outsider who calls the characters by their own names, Harry and Mary. In addition, the narrator is omniscient because he is all-knowing and takes the reader inside the character's thoughts, feelings, and motives, as well as shows what the characters say and do. These characteristics of the omniscient narrator are clear in the following quote. "There was uncomfortable, stifling sensation in her throat, and something very like a tear glittering in her eye." Settings. Setting is the physical and social context in which the action of a story occurs. So, from the following quote, it can be inferred that this short story is developed in a domestic environment. Mary stood behind the curtain and looked after him as he went down the street. In terms of the socio-economic environment and the geographical location, the story takes place in an upper-class stratum of a developed country, due to the descriptions of the house and the gifts that Harry gave to Mary. There were statues and pictures and vases, all gifts from him either before or since their marriage. In regards to the time period, it is presented in a contemporary epoch, likely in the first middle of the last century. It is because Harry worked in an office and Mary was a housewife who respected the whims of her husband. Perhaps, after all, Harry was right about Mrs. May, and if he was not, one hair of his head was worth more to her than all the women in the world. Besides, by means of the elements of the text, it could be deduced that the story unfolds during a day because Harry goes to his office in the morning after discussing with Mary, and he comes back to his house at night. The lamps were not lit in the drawing room when Harry came up the street. He passed slowly through the hall, entered the dark and deserted room. Characters. Both Mary and Harry are the main characters. She is a little wife, a weak-willed woman because she respects her husband's desires over her friendship with Mrs. May. She is described by Harry as a yielding and impulsive woman. Mary is a dynamic character, since she changes her behavior due to the course of the story. She learns the lesson. In contrast, Harry is a male chauvinist and mandatory man. Will you give up Mrs. May for my sake, Mary? Although he is described by the omniscient narrator as a kind, affectionate, and sensible husband, he had never said one unkind word to her. Never. Harry is a wrong character because he doesn't change his position about the relationship between his wife and Mrs. May. He wins the game. On the other hand, there is Mrs. May who doesn't appear in the story. She is just mentioned by Mary as a ladylike, refined, intellectual, and fascinating woman. Mrs. May is a minor and static character because she remains the same throughout the course of the storyline.
In the plot line, we could see many quotes about this story, and for example, in the exposition, we could see how the author shows us the characters and the situation in which they are involved. Then we have the rising action, and after that we have the climax in which Mary feels attacked by her husband. Then we have the falling action, and finally we have the resolution or the conclusion in which Mary decided to stay at home waiting for her husband. Conflict, as we know, is a literary element that involves a struggle between two opposing forces, usually a protagonist and an antagonist. Here in this story, we could see that the conflict is man versus self, because here Mary has an internal conflict about what she should do: go with Mrs. May or stay at home waiting for her husband. About the examples, here we have some of them. First one, Mrs. May. She was so smart and satirical. She would make so much sport of her for being ruled so by Harry. And another one, yes, she would go. She had quite made up her mind to that. Irony is a literary device in which contradictory situations reveal a reality that is different from what appears to be true. There are many ways of irony in literature. For example, here we have some quotes about how husbands may rule. The first one is verbal irony. Dear reader, won't you tell? There are some husbands worth all the sacrifices a loving heart can make. The second one, situational irony. Be sure, dear Harry, that's going too far. Don't be disagreeable. Let us talk of something else. As old Uncle Jeff says, how straight. and she looked earnestly in his face. Harry didn't smile.
In this short story, the theme is presented in the actions and the conversations between the characters. The wife is conquered by the husband. She does what he wants. Therefore, this short story illustrates the principles of domesticity and submissiveness in marriage. For example, Harry asked Mary to stop being involved with Mrs. May since she was detrimental to their marriage. Although Mary was not willing to end her friendship with Mrs. May, she eventually did as she was told. This demonstrates Mary's submissiveness to her husband's demands. In addition, the author mocks the way that Mary is submissive to her husband, Harry. The author then ends the story with a satirical tone, saying that love conquers and that something should be given up for love. There are many symbols in this short story. There are things and characters that suggest other meanings, and the symbols add depth or make more sense to the short story. For instance, Harry is a symbol of male chauvinism and gender inequality. Moreover, he represents the typical men that work in an office. Also, the little gem, the statuettes, the pretty bracelets, pictures, and vases, all these gifts from Harry to Mary represent Harry's love for her. In addition, Mary is a symbol. Mary did what Harry wanted. It symbolizes Mary's submissiveness to her husband's demands. Also, the choice edition of poems with Mary's name represents Harry's love for Mary, and perhaps, as Mary's friend had suggested, the poems represented an attempt by Harry to rule Mary. So, this is how the symbols are fundamental to support the main theme of this short story. We can find some early clues about what will happen later in this short story. Those clues may create suspense by hinting at things to come. For instance, love conquered, the pretty road was farther away, the Jules returned to their case, and with a light heart, Mary sat down to await her husband's return. This is an early clue about the end of Mary, her final decision. Also, a slight shade of vexation crossed Mary's pretty face. This is another clue about what will happen in this short story. Another example is when Harry told Mary that he wanted her to end her friendship with May. Mary made a joke on him and Harry didn't smile. Harry made no reply and in a few moments was on his way to his office. Harry's actions are a clue that indicates what will happen and how this short story will transform. A very varied style is presented in this short story. First, the author demonstrates a satirical style with the final sentence. The reader, when you tell, there are some husbands worth all the sacrifices a loving heart can make. Also, the author has a conversational style where exclamation marks are used a lot to give emotion. Thus, the dialogue between the characters is very important. For example, the reader, dear Harry, said a welcome voice at his side. God bless you, Mary, said the happy husband. You saved me from a keen sorrow. Furthermore, there is a simple and spontaneous style, since the author doesn't use very complicated vocabulary. For example, Mary stood behind the curtain and looked after him as he went down the street. There was a stifling sensation in her throat and something very like a tear glittering in her eye.
Figurative language. Personification. A slight shade of vexation crossed Mary's pretty face. The concept a slight shade of vexation is carrying out a human being action. It crossed Mary's face. Simile. Something very like a tear glittering in her eye. Anything is in Mary's eye, something like a tear. In this sentence, something in Mary's eye is compared directly with a tear. Metaphor. Love conquered. There is a metaphor because love is understood as a territory to be conquered. Personification. The Yells return to their cases. There, the Yells are the subject of the sentence. They are returning to their case. In that sense, the author is giving the attributes of a human being to that object.
The sensory language is a way in which the writer helps us to see or connect the story with an image, description, action, or scene. This is the language that connects the five senses: hearing, sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch with the text to create an image in our mind. For example, here we have some quotes about how husbands may rule. Auditory imagery. "Dear Harry," said a welcome voice at his side. Visual imagery. The trimmings readjusted and remodeled, and all the little etceteras of her toilet decided.